In 1992, Ron Athey staged his first major ensemble performance, Martyrs and Saints. This is the first of what the artist calls his torture trilogy. It was followed by 4 scenes in a Harsh Life from 1993 to 1996 and Deliverance in 1995. These works were performed in the US, Mexico, and in Europe. In 1999, the film Hallelujah, Ron Athey, A Story of Deliverance by documentary filmmaker Catherine Gund about performance artist Ron Athey was released. And in the film, we enter and discover the work of Ron and his company during this time. Upon the release of this film, professor and scholar of law Kendall Thomas interviewed Cat Gund for Bomb magazine. So in today's conversation, we're here to look back in order to look at today and remember what it was like for an artist like Ron Athey to make work during the filming of Hallelujah and describe a legacy of resistance, resilience, survival, and activism to get us to how work is made today, Ron's influences, and the importance of persistence against such forces as censorship and social justice. We've made the film available for the public to view on their own from July 26th to 28th, so it should still be available to view after this talk until about midnight. If you missed it, well, you can purchase the film through Aubin Pictures. So we're going to start back in the 90s and talk about the making of this film. So I'd love to hear from Kat and Ron. We'd all like to hear from Kat and Ron about how you met.
Kind of long distance before there was online, I started working with Julie Tolentino, who was in the David Rusev Dance Company. She was doing the Click Club and some other clubs in Manhattan. And so she kind of long distance started managing me and eventually ended up in the company. So after a year of faxing every day, all day long, we met at a tattoo convention in San Diego. And then on a trip to New York, I met Kat. So it was through Julie Tolentino.
Julie was just raving and raving. And yes. This is where I'm going. This is where we're going. Come with me. And if you remember, I mean, I keep thinking about that time and how really special and unique it was that it coincided with the availability of these smaller camcorders. So before that, you know, there were big video cameras and you needed 2 or 3 people to handle them. And it was obviously long before everyone had a video camera. So there was something special about having this camera and all of us were figuring out what our relationship to it was. And Julie really wanted this to be recorded. Everybody wanted things to be recorded. Because we didn't have that access to create our own images and to create our own archive and our own picture our own resistance. And she took me to shows, and then you were on your way to Mexico. It really wasn't even to make a movie. Nobody thought we were making a movie. Film at that time was just a part of how we interacted with each other. It was like, we're going to have sex, or we're going to put on a theater show, or we're going to go dancing, or we're going to film something. And so Ron said, I'm going to Mexico. They've given me money to bring my entourage. I'm going to bring an acupuncturist and a yoga teacher and a massage therapist and my own camera woman. And I want you to come with us. And it was fascinating because I recalled Kendall talking with you about how I wasn't even on the outside documenting, you know, when we got to Mexico, there were parts of the performance that I would integrate it onto the stage because the ex Teresa, you can talk about that incredible monument to you know, cruelty and abjectness, but it was very long and narrow, and there were people in the way back, and there was this very fine sewing, and so we set it up so that what I was filming was actually projected in the back of this decommissioned church. So we got, you know, once we were there and doing that, then it just became, oh, we'll film this. And when we got back, we should go to LA and make sure that, I guess UCLA at the time was collecting some materials about you and the estate project for artists with AIDS. And they wanted to have some interviews to contextualize the work that I was filming. And suddenly there was all this material. And so we made a movie.
And that was October 1995, and the connection to Exteresa was set up by Guillermo Gomez Peña. And it was paid for by teaching in Mexico, by doing 2 benefits in LA, doing a benefit at the Fault Line, doing a benefit at La Luz de Jesus Gallery within Waco Soap Plant. So we had 25 people. And they had, within this desanctioned convent, there are 2 chapels, and then the courtyard ruins, which border Templo Mayor, the Aztec ruins. So, it was in a very important spot. And so we became ambitious to do every piece from the torture trilogy. So we started out with Martyrs and Saints in one chapel, in a 30-minute intermission, switched out and did 4 scenes in A Harsh Life. Or in the middle of the intermission, actually, Alex Benny and Julie Tolentino did an excerpt from Deliverance, which wasn't finished yet then. So that was on the walls of the ruins. So it was like a 6-hour night, and everybody stayed. It was a duration of high theatricality. It wasn't just sitting in a chair wanking for 6 hours, by that prescription of what endurance art is. It's actually boom, boom, boom.
Can you talk a little more about the way you were working? Because this was a period of time when you were working with a group and a troupe. So maybe a little more about that work.
Yeah, always from the early 90s. And it was largely people on the scene at Club Fuck and knowing what people would do with their bodies if they were, how they entered the material, AIDSy material, I called it. So it was Julie, Pigpen, Divinity Fudge, Cross. It was kind of this, and the violinist Julie Fowles. We used, probably the entire group was like 15 people, but there was a core group of 8, and they kind of Brian Murphy. There's a list of people who aren't alive anymore in that crew, but. So as soon as I forget now, it's called Ron Athey and Company because it had a menagerie.
Yeah, and there's I just immediately get this energy of making, and hey, Kat, come along and let's go, and it's in Mexico and Europe and LA, and it's incredible. But I'd like for all of you and for our audience to sort of recall what it was like at that time, the context of the AIDS crisis and the culture wars.
Well, I know that. Well, I guess by 95, I was aware of the culture wars. But before that, I didn't even particularly use the word artist, because I just made these images, which started at underground galleries in the 80s. By 92, Dennis Cooper and Bob Flanagan asked me to do something at Lace. And then I just saw Dennis at the Queer Communion show and hugged it out twice through the mask, so you never know what someone's feeling. I guess it was like always being scrutinized. Once the Walker happened, I realized, even it'd be like in Copenhagen, they'd have health and safety from the city, from the county, and from the country, like 3 levels of security watching. Even up to 2010 in Warsaw, the mayor decided, without telling me, that the audience couldn't come up to me, and it was a circular thing, so they were on a platform, and then the space had to be disinfected by a fumigator afterwards while I was still in there. Really, and that was like a throwback to a 90s nightmare, but in 2010. So these phobias don't go away, but that's why I sort of pulled out the everybody was piercers or ex-nurses, or even Divinity was a mortician at one time. So the amount of training and blood and airborne pathogens in the crew was deep. And we had everybody's paperwork ready to show. and didn't let it bother us really or hold us back.
It's so interesting because I know we will get to a point where we talk about the current pandemic, which is very different than the last pandemic, but the stigma, I think, is something people still can't wrap their minds around. There's gay marriage now, there's, you know, some treatments. This was before the cocktail. Like, this was still when people really felt like there was nothing, no treatments, nothing that was going to help at all. And so, you know, and people were dying so fast. And it was, this all happened before 96, you know, which is when those combination therapies came out. But the stigma, I would say the stigma, you know, the fact that those are such big differences. It's not just stigma, it's what I think Kendall speaks about really beautifully, which is the abject and the disgust and the horror and the projection of people's fears onto the queer body and onto the bloodiness and the ritual, and how sort of Ron's shape-shifting with that was really able to transform, where now, you know, there isn't the same stigma and we already have a vaccine. You know, there's still no vaccine for AIDS or HIV. Kendall, what else do you think to contextualize the early 90s as distinct from maybe the later 90s or now?
Well, I think you've touched on a lot of themes that, for me, resonate with my memories of living through that time. I think that central to those, though, is the force and the formal power in Ron's work of the queer body, right? So this is performance art, or an art of performativity, in which the body as matter, as an individual body, but also the relationship of the individual body to other bodies, raised for me the question of queer sociality, right? And the ways in which abjection, which you're right, Kat, was a central question that you and I explored in the bomb interview. Abjection allows us to tell a story not just about individual bodies, but about a shared sociality, right? About a participatory experience in which I know my body through the bodies of others. And Ron's work, I think, was distinctive in the emphasis that it placed on the queering of a body, of the body, not just as a private experience, but as the experience of a queer public, right? To which others could be witness and even participants, because one of the things that struck me about the Hallelujah documentary was the extent to which, Kat, not just your camera, but your body, your very body became part of the experience that you were documenting. So I would like to, at this moment of viral individualism, remember the power of community, both as an aesthetic and as something that is actually enacted in Ron's work, of communitas as an event that's fleeting, ephemeral, spontaneous, concrete, and immediate, that appears and disappears between and around and through the performance, which is of the now, but which is, by virtue of its embodiment, a line of connection between individuals and the social body, individual bodies and the social body. I think that is something that is at risk, not just in social life, but in the arts, in this post, if post is the right word, in this post neoliberal moment where everything centers around the individual, either as artistic creator or the individual as a participant in artistic market culture. So the moment that you documented in Ron's work and the queer communion, which I think thematically organizes the exhibition, I think is very powerful as uh, um, 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 a site and a tool for remembering uh, the connections between the individual and social body that we've really lost sight of in this post-queer moment.
This is incredible to hear, and I'm hearing how you processed what you saw by seeing this film, and now that we've had 22 years of reflection, that now we're sort of situating that film, that moment, that revelation to today. So moving on with this moment of discovery, this moment of revelation, Kendall and Kat, we're going to continue with the time of releasing this film, and then also how the interview happened. I mean, who organized that? And Kendall, it's were you the one to say I need to interview that, or how was that organized?
Well, Kat, you can correct me. I'm a person of a certain age now, and my memory is not what it used to be. But I think that the idea for this interview, or at least of doing an interview that would be in BOM, grew out of an interview that the writer Lynn Tillman had done with me in BOM, and for which Kat took some photographs. I have this memory of standing in the middle of Fifth Avenue or someplace like that with you and your camera. Is that ringing any bells, Kat?
Yeah, the whole
Yeah.
thing is a big blur. We're the same approximate.
But I think that the idea for the BOM interview came out of the fact that we already had a relationship with the publication, which of course has this rich history of pairing people to talk about their work. And I must say, I don't remember whether it was something we pitched or whether BOM came to us. But I can say that I'm very glad that we did it. And as I went back and reread the interview, I got this kind of heady rush. It seems to me that we were able, because of the work of people like Ron Athey and the kinds of really radical aesthetic experiments that they were undertaking, that Ron was undertaking, it opened up new horizons for talking about the politics of culture, talking about cultural politics, and about the relationship between culture and politics that had been at the very center, for example, of the work that Kat and I did in ACT UP, which is where we met. And as you know, ACT UP was not just about AIDS activism at the level of policy, which unfortunately is what is remembered most today. But I think there were some radical explorations of the uses of arts and culture as both vehicles and platforms and sites of political work. So the interview that we did really allowed us, using Ron as a pretext and an occasion, to 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 think through out loud together, Kat and I, a lot of the questions that had emerged for us out of the practical work of AIDS activism and thinking about issues of arts, culture, and representation as sites for uh, radical political work around the issue of HIV/AIDS and health justice.
I love that idea, like a building on our community, us meeting in community of this very tight knit, literally sort of throbbing queer body of ACT UP, and how that translate. Like, I feel like was interesting when I reread it was also thinking about how film was a way to help us keep going, literally to stay alive. Like, I think of film as this sort of counter narrative to death, right? How can we keep someone alive? We just film them, and yet it was also providing us a place to rest and stop and reflect. And I think that combination is really powerful, and to me speaks a lot to how we approach the filmmaking as another art form on top of theater and the performance art. That they're both these time-based, but we weren't documenting the work. We were actually sort of creating more family, more community in that gathering in order to allow rejuvenation and to allow a healing and to, like, literally the filmmaking and the storytelling around Ron's work became like a port in the storm. That's what we were talking about earlier, this idea of being kept in chaos, that our lives, which for many of us in many ways remain there, sort of jumbled and unwieldy and always on our back foot, and that there was a way that coming together in the creating of our relationships and also the creating of the artwork together gave us this harbor, this port, this place to be, and we all created these different relationships.
Absolutely. And those relationships, again, I come back to this notion of queer communion, which I don't think one can overemphasize the power of that frame and framing as a way of understanding not just Ron's aesthetic practice, but things like film and video making and the role of these artistic and cultural practices in these activist communities, or these communities that were brought together around activism at that time, because we need to remember the origins of the arts in rites, RITE, and in religion, and the ways in which, particularly in the face of the death that was happening all around us, well into the 90s, and the trauma, right, of watching the beautiful bodies of our friends waste away, we were able, by remembering and documenting and building communities of remembrance through film and video and other artistic practices, the performance arts. We were able to remember and engage in a kind of what Kant calls in the metaphysics of morals, a kind of reverence, uh, 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 um, an affective communion, the celebration and creation of the feeling of a special kind, as Kant calls it, and to think about it. I'll stay with Kant for a moment. To think of it as a kind of duty that we had to the future. I was on the inaugural board of directors of the New York City AIDS Memorial, and my early conversations about joining the board were with two young queer men who had no memory of the early years of the epidemic, but who had access to that history because of the work that Kat and artists like Ron had done. I don't think we were thinking at that time that what we were creating was something that could be remembered by future generations. But I'm grateful that the three of us have lived long enough to see the work that folks like Kat and Ron did in the 90s become a resource for younger people. And I think there's something sacred in the fullest sense of the word. There, that is a site of a queer communion that for me has something of the sacred about it. And I wouldn't want us to lose sight of that. And I want you, Ron, and you, Kat, to know that the young people I talk to, as someone who is in daily contact with young students and activists, are grateful that this record was left for them to be able to learn about what the life world of that moment was like for those who lived and died during that time.
It's literally like remembering the future. You know,
Exactly,
it's like,
exactly.
I wrote down this quote from Sans Soleil, Chris Marker, a film that I love. And he says, I wonder how people remember who don't film and who don't photograph and who don't tape. How has mankind managed to remember?
Mm, mm.
It just felt to me like exactly what you were saying, which was this, and the desperation that Ron so easily and fluidly, generously shares, both in the film and in his work, of being able to say, I don't, you know, I don't want to die yet. I want to figure out what is my mark. That's the line that just goes through my head all the time about Hallelujah. I want to leave my mark. What's my mark? And I feel like, you know, your work is your mark, the film is your mark, and here we are. I mean, Kendall, that's like to say that we're all still here to see how the future made sense of our work is really a luxury, privilege.
And a privilege, yeah. Thank you for that, Kat.
It's strange that I've mostly used performance as an outlet in my work, because part of this frenzy I'm in with AIDS is, oh my God, I'm going to die in a few years and I have to leave my mark. What's my mark? How did Ron Athey change the world? How did Ron Athey shake things up and subvert things? What did I leave behind? Was I just some stupid fag who died of AIDS, or was I just this damaged boy who was never a minister, who rebelled and lashed out at himself, so between drugs and promiscuous sex he contracted a disease and died? Do you know, it's like this frenzy to make it bigger, to make it more, to make it mean something. And how can you do this without God? How can you do this without spirituality? How can you do this without a belief system and a support group?
Ron, what do you think?
Well, I was thinking about a lot of work of that time and deaths that rattled me, like David Warnerovich, and how powerful, particularly that spoken word was, that really let it all out and was never corny. And then also Diamanda's tattoo, we are all HIV positive. I think of the whole Walker scandal, that divinity was HIV negative, but this guilty by association, which, you know, made me think more about the polemic of blood, trying to look at these things from the outside, how they actually drove the readings of symbols at that time. And then on community, like thinking of how badly community was needed and how meaningfully it was formed to show up for those sickness and deaths and the actions that had to come to reinforce the community. Because there was a dwindling community, you know, like rapidly, and certainly some of the strongest people in it went down hard. Look, you know, look, the last time we looked back at the film, I felt like this is what's wrong with me now. The glitch, you know, this like pieces missing of me, or ways I act oddly, I think, behavior wise. You can't carry it all the time. even though it formed me.
I'm programmed to carry a message. The message isn't programmed, but that I'm a vehicle is the most important thing in my life. It's like more important in my life, which that scares me sometimes. That I'm a conduit is the most important thing in my life. It's more important than me being happy. It's more important than me being comfortable. It's more important than me being healthy.
So we're getting into the area that is talking about how AIDS was the pandemic crisis of hallelujah. And now we have COVID-19 as the pandemic crisis of queer communion. And you clearly said it, Kat. COVID-19 got its vaccine, in fact, several vaccines, and the AIDS virus does not have one. So maybe we can talk about what have we learned from the AIDS crisis that may have helped the COVID crisis. I know, Kat, we talked about that a bit. It's interesting to see these parallels. And then also in conjunction with the pandemic, we also have a crisis of hate and tensions in that area. We had an incredible summer of uprising, and so that is happening where it'd be interesting to see how, now that I'm hearing all of these reflections about the power of hallelujah and the power of Ron, the perseverance of Ron to sort of reveal the fear, as Kendall often says, the fear behind the hate. So maybe we can talk about all of that, the parallels that are happening. I know that even though the AIDS virus does not have a vaccine, we had a discussion earlier where Kat, you had pointed out that so much of what we had gone through in the AIDS crisis actually helped us handle, even though we might point out a lot of mishandling, but allowed us to get through the COVID crisis in some ways.
Well, the development of the vaccine for sure, and I wasn't a treatment specific activist and don't understand all the science, but I do know that what they developed was what they were learning at that time. But even things like at the very beginning of the crisis, the COVID crisis in New York City, they put out a how to have sex in a pandemic flyer from the New York City Department of Health, and it just read exactly what we had written.
Which had to do in large part with the fact that in New York City, at least, a number of the people who have been involved in public health policy making are the heirs of or were directly involved in the AIDS activist movement and were shaped by the knowledge of public health that the AIDS activist movement helped create. And frankly, there's a kind of historical continuity, obviously, in the figure of Tony Fauci. But I think the central lesson that the HIV/AIDS pandemic, if we want to learn it, offers is that every pandemic is a social pandemic. Right? And it's precisely the social dimensions of this pandemic that, for me at least, have brought home what an extraordinary achievement the queer community was able to make happen, right? During that time. I mean, we really created, in Greg Bordowitz's phrase, a constituency of the disease. And we might talk, if there's time, a little bit about the aesthetics of dis-ease that Ron's work explores. This constituency of the diseased and an ethics of queer care and of mutuality and concern for one another that was at the base, not just of taking care of people who fell sick, but which was at the base of prevention, right? And it's really hard for us in this age. I know I'm going to get into a little trouble with this, but in this age of sexual libertarianism, in which we hold up the figure of the Truvada whore and have lost entirely the idea that when I have sex with you, I'm having sex with every person you've ever had sex with and are likely to have sex with in the future. And that when I'm having sex with you, I'm doing so within the context of a commitment, a communal, community-based commitment to sexual health, in which I'm concerned not just about HIV, but about a whole battery of STIs. In the age of the Truvada whore and of the regnant sexual libertarianism, which is celebrated, I'm sad to say, by some people who were in the front lines of AIDS activism, I mourn, frankly, the loss of community that made the achievement of AIDS activism across so many dimensions possible. It has been overtaken by a kind of viral individualism in which I think of questions of queer health only in terms of my body and whether I stay well. And we really created something queer. We didn't know how queer it was because the norm we're seeing in the absence of a sense of a society, the norm in this moment, particularly in this current moment of mixed messaging around masking and the like, is to do what I want to do, even if that doesn't mean taking care of myself, right? So the idea of freedom is the freedom not just to put myself at risk, but to put you at risk. We forged a very different conception of sexual freedom and of queer freedom during those years, whose legacy, I think, has been forgotten and aggressively overtaken by, again, a kind of sexual libertarianism. I think that, I'm still mourning that. I'm gonna leave that alone. But I just needed to get that out there because I've been really mindful of it, looking back, from this current moment of what an extraordinary thing in terms of not just policy, but an ethics of pleasure, right? Safe sex is hot sex, right? There was so much that we were able to contribute in terms of the ethics and a cultural politics and a culture of public sex that we have utterly lost.
Yeah, it's almost like what you're saying makes me think that the deployment and interpretation in the present day of the notion of harm reduction, which we certainly, if not invented, amplified and defined, is now in this, as you're saying, this sort of service of the individual. Instead of harm reduction is about us saying we need to be together and we need to figure out how to measure our risks to care for all of us.
Right.
And that's what harm reduction is, as opposed to saying, I'm going to do this because I don't think I'm going to get COVID. It's not, you know what I mean? Like,
No.
the line is, I mean, it was also the exquisite cruelty of COVID that it separated people. It was closer to the skin during early AIDS crisis. And just the quarantine, the separation of people from people for longer than people have ever done.
Yeah, across the society. You know, I sometimes wonder, how much difference do you think it made, Kat and Ron, that those of us who were affected by and most conscious of HIV/AIDS, even before we knew, right? Even before we had a name for it, were not seen as part of what was then referred to as the general public, right? So in a sense, the segregation of HIV/AIDS and the segregation of the bodies of people and the communities that were thought to be affected by it created a space for building a queer public and a queer ethics for us, right? That was an alternative to the vision of our bodies as sort of almost endemically diseased, right? It's important to remember that, you know, this was a period in which it was, the Supreme Court had held that it was not at all problematic as a matter of constitutional law to arrest and sentence people to 20 years in prison for having sex with someone of the same gender, right? And we have this criminalization, these laws that were passed criminalizing HIV infection, right? And we are so far from that world, right? Because the general public is not immune to CoV-SARS-2 in the way that it thought it was, right? During the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So I think that that's a piece of the picture too.
Yes, it's hard to remember how much judgment went on in that those communities became oppressed communities because of that, and sort of, I think a magic energy came out of that, like by pulling together. It was part of it for certain. And you know, I'm still in the free healthcare system, and when there's not enough money for anything, the name Ryan White comes back up. And then I remember that split, the innocent victims versus the guilty victims. Like it was actually a governmental split. If you got HIV from a blood transfusion and you were like a angel-faced child, you know, your name is still called up for funding.
For some reason, everyone in the cast identifies with a demonstration of pain to represent how they feel about this life. Everybody is marginalized in different ways, from everything from size to race to gender identity to, you know, just being a freak. And they're all pretty comfortable with it.
Please, he must be remembered as more than just a piece of meat.
They also don't demand that I explain my work. I channel pieces, you know, and then fine tune them. I think they seem to like the way I work, but I don't have a master plan.
Thought we might be talking, you know, you talk about this time when you filmed, when filming for Hallelujah was happening, was sort of called what you described your blacklist time. And so I'd like you to speak about these changing contexts. I mean, we alluded to it a bit because of how it's hard to wrap your head around what it was like back then. And we seem to have so much more positive things happening that you can't imagine how awful it was back then. But then, you know, Ron, you were creating, despite it all, you managed to create, you dated in clubs you were the blacklisted individual, as you say, and didn't get institutional recognition. And here we are 22 years later after the film, and we have a retrospective. And we we were just talking about how many events we have around the show in August. I'm wondering about that, talking about this freedom to create. And
I like to talk about the DIY aesthetic. And so when I was blacklisted, the only two places I ever performed was or 3 Randolph Street Gallery, Chicago, Walker Art Center, and then after the scandal, PS 122 was the most overhyped. There were like 35 journalists running in for free every night. And, it's America. We rely on box office for a chunk of the thing to be paid. I don't want to pay for the media to say what everyone else is already saying. So that was like a lot of headache and a lot of responsibility fell on me to defend this arts funding that I had never actually gotten. I didn't understand the system. So, but because I'm a good person, of course I believe that art should be funded. But do I believe that spaces should pull their punch to keep getting that funding? Like that was where I differed from the party line and knew that they were never going to show me again. So eventually I moved to England, and when I can't, even when I was there, that's when the Hammer Museum brought me out in 2014, and it broke the curse. And then I realized there isn't, none of those spaces were getting government money anyways. By then we're in this system we're in now, where rich people are on board of directors, et cetera. So shifting into that reality, but 95 to 2014 is kind of a long stretch. And the shows I did do in the US during that time, I self-produced. Sometimes I would rent a venue and do it, and then later things like crowdsourcing made other things. I still work that way. I'm not high on the grantee list. 2018, I got 3 grants, and that was it in my life in the States. So I still apply because I have a friend that always says, apply for the Guggenheim, apply for the California. But I sell merch. I'll do a once in a while crowdfunder. I do body work to finish editing a video. I did 15 massages. That's how I still work at 60, because I won't sit here and wait for someone to think it's time for my work again. I'll be 70 by then if I live that long. I don't play it that way. So I just think you have to make work if you make work, and not let the situations eat you up.
And I will point out that in the exhibition Queer Communion, there are a number of films, and we are screening them in a beautiful projection room. And we also have smaller monitors for your film. So we can talk about how you also kept up with the documentation, and we can talk about continuing that, from that moment of realizing the important documentation, or what you had created, the port of safety and reflection that Hallelujah was. And now let's talk about how we, in our digital age and the wide sharing of material and content, how are our voices today? How are they carrying forth not only creative work, but also that sustaining that importance of seeing and being able to discuss around these topics of social justice and more.
I just want to make this shift really quick, that in the early 90s, I really believed in the live experience and was always embarrassed if a camera was there, even a photo camera, that was standing in front of somebody's experience. And little did I know everyone would be holding up an iPhone, mediating what's happening right in front of them. Like this, you see people with that little illumination. But definitely the filming of Hallelujah and seeing things played back, and made me even look at scenes different, like from 4 scenes, the suicide bed scene. When I finally saw that in video, it's what kind of made me gravitate towards experimenting with solo work, that I could tap into that. And yeah, digital made quality raise up without needing a huge film budget. You didn't have to flood out the stage with white lights, you know, and ruin it as a live experience.
How is that playing out in education, Kendall?
Well, I'm just coming out of a year and a half of doing all of my teaching online. It's opened up for me a number of possibilities. So I may be in the minority of people who are in education because I think that digital media, social media, the opportunities for bringing in people from different parts of the world in real time in a class that just weren't available before. I found myself giving a lecture at noon in London and doing a workshop at dinner time in Rio de Janeiro, kind of exhilarating. And so I think even though we're going back into face-to-face classroom teaching, or at least that's the plan, with some trepidation to be sure, in the fall, my sense is that the technological literacy and the digital media literacy that we've acquired in the pandemic are going to remain a permanent feature of our work. As Kat knows, I've in the last few years ventured into live performance. I've done several shows, solo vocal shows at Joe's Pub at the New York Public Theater. And if there is one thing I've missed, it's not being able to make music for a live audience, because and I'm sure Ron, you'll agree with me, there's something about doing your work in three-dimensional space with other bodies, particularly work that involves sound, when you know that the sound is penetrating the bodies of the people who are listening to you, that makes for a very different experience. I think that's one reason why musical artists in particular are so looking forward to live performance, because it's not just about the music, it's about the music making and the reception of the music making, which happens, of course, not just through the ears, but through the whole body. You can, if you have really great equipment, you can make good music that people can hear, but it's not quite the same thing as when the instruments and the persons making the music are actually a few feet away from you. But we know that as long as so many folks are unvaccinated, that kind of closed-in live performance will remain a COVID incubator. I think, we'll see in the next year this hybrid situation of live and virtual performance and social engagement. That I, I'm really interested. I'm really looking forward to reading the histories, particularly the cultural histories of this moment, that will undoubtedly come out of this experience.
I think that's amazing, and I'm also fascinated to hear, and I appreciate that you're saying these things right now, all three of you, because I think what we're going to find is how they change, maybe not radically, but the feelings and the manifestations, the cultural manifestations will evolve. I think for me, I feel like, unfortunately, like this super nostalgic person because of so much loss so early, and it's the loss of the bodies of people. And what I was saying in the beginning about the film being an effort to hold on to something. I mean, I still share it with people, but actually the COVID adaptation of conversations like this around the release of my last film for the last year, we did like 50 of these. And it ended up, like you're saying, Kendall, reaching so many other people and bringing together people in a way that, you know, I'm looking at everybody's faces and I don't get that kind of an intimate relationship when I'm in a big room. But on the other hand, I think what I've been struggling with since making Hallelujah, whatever, 22 years is sort of, why is it so hard to depict on film, to depict happiness? Why is it so hard to envision happiness, to risk happiness? And to me, that really is about the communal experience, whether it's with sound or artwork or whatever, that joy for me will come from being with people and having that physical connection with all the senses. And, you know, which is why the live performance that Ron did, I knew right away. There was no way I was going to make it better by documenting it. I needed to create something that was different than trying to be at a performance. And I think just working towards figuring out how to combine those, because our artwork is all our art and our ways that we interact, education, curating, you know, writing, like there's all these teaching. I know Ron does teaching too, even massage. I mean, Ron, massage, but I think of, you know, the difference between everybody's experience right now with the media and the Zoom is that, you know, and me, is that I think of film as being incredibly tactile, as being a skin, as being an object, as being something that I'm molding like I would play or touching the way I would a body. Go ahead, Ron.
I think Participant did a good job with the opening performance. So February 16th, which was still scary, at the, you know, 2 days after Queer Communion opened in New York, we did a performance with 10 people in the gallery. And then the genius Glenn Fogel set up like 6 cameras and live VJ'd. And then the front window has this gunk on it that turns it into a rear projection screen. So there are 20 people out in the black ice watching from outside that mix happening, and also a camera picking up the mix happening from outside through the frosty window. And so all of that coming together and the angle switching brought it to life. And it's also showing at the ICA now as a finished document of these 3 scenes, which was a Elliot Reed spoken word pistol poem with 4 boys, and then the human printing press on my chest, guaranteed HIV positive blood. It's kind of a flashback to '94. But I was surprised, like I almost forgot what happened, like, because it had the live rush with even just 10 people, one of which was you know, the great writer Cindy Carr, which thrilled me. Somebody in their 70s, double masked and put on their winter coat and came out.
That's great. So I guess the lesson of that is that all art is mediated and always has been, right? So mediation is not an exception or deviation from an unmediated norm. Mediation is the basic reality of art making. And these technologies that we've all inhabited for the last year and some months, if we are willing to think about how we've engaged them, I think really do confront us with the mediated character, even when the mediators are vanishing, to use Fred Jameson's phrase, are our reality. So it's somehow very appropriate that we're having this conversation in the way we're having it at this moment. And that this mediated record of our mediated queer communion, right, will be available for future publics to, in a mediated way, access.
I think we can't go any further. This is a perfect way to end. We are kept in chaos and we will persevere. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much.
That's good. Thank you.
Great to see you all.
Joel and Kat.
Congratulations on the show.
And
Thank you.
congratulations, Ron.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you. Thank you all.